Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Viking's Shadow by L Marsay, narrated by Hannibal Hills. Chapter 1. Across 6 letters. This Norseman may be the Romans' number 6 monarch. In York, it was 6 o'clock on a Friday evening in late September. The sun was already beginning to set, and a cool wind was blowing through the city. Detective Chief Inspector John Shadow cursed under his breath as he edged slowly along Parliament Street. He was pressed up against a metal barricade put in place to hold back the crowds. To his right, visitors and locals alike pushed forward. To his left marched the great heathen army. They were shouting and cheering loudly as they held axes and burning torches aloft. A 6-foot-tall Viking strode by with a long, red, plaited beard, flowing green cloak, and brandishing a gleaming broadsword. His impressively convincing appearance was spoilt only by the mobile phone tucked neatly into his woven leather belt. Shadow always noticed these small details about people, even if he did endeavour to avoid their company. York held its annual Viking Festival every year in September to coincide with the ancient heathen feast of Husbloot. The idea was to celebrate the city's Norse heritage. After all, it was the Vikings who called the city Jorvik that eventually became the modern-day name of York. Usually, Shadow avoided the city centre like the plague when the festival was on. Somehow this year it had slipped his mind. From the moment he'd stepped out of the station, he'd been caught up in the crowds. Now he was trapped. A middle-aged man of average height with slightly greying dark hair, in a suit and wax jacket, his unremarkable appearance now made him stand out. His every step was blocked by either camera-toting tourists in fake beards and plaits, or excitable small children with wooden swords and horned helmets. Shadow's empty stomach grumbled in complaint. At this rate, he would never make it to Francesco's. He adored Italian food, and each night ate in one of the city's many excellent restaurants. It should only have been a 5-minute walk over to La Scuolo Femminile on Petergate, but tonight it was going to take him much longer. Finally, the Norse warriors and their followers spilled out into St. Sampson's Square. Shadow strained his neck. He thought he could see a path through. However, just as he was about to make his escape, he found his way blocked by a familiar red-haired figure holding a dictaphone. "Have you got a quote for the Herald readers regarding this year's festival, Chief Inspector?" asked Kevin McNabb, a journalist from the city's local paper and one of Shadow's least favourite people. "Not one you could print," growled Shadow in response as he pushed his way past. Making a swift escape was going to be harder than he'd hoped. The whole of St. Sampson's Square had been turned into a Viking village, with tents dedicated to various aspects of the life of the average Norseman. There was a weaving demonstration in one, and a blacksmith was forging a sword in another. In the next tent, Shadow found Edward Bennington, one of the city's leading experts on Vikings. Edward owned a bookshop on Fossgate. This evening he was retelling the history of King Ragnar and his warring sons to an enraptured audience. "The vengeful Anglo-Saxons threw brave King Ragnar into a pit of snakes to kill him, and his sons, Ivar, Ubar, and Sigurd, swore vengeance." Edward's voice was thin and reedy, but Shadow had to admire the effort he had put into his costume, complete with an eye patch and a raven perched on his shoulder. In the audience, Shadow spotted his colleague, Sergeant George Headley. His little grandson was sitting on his lap and looked completely enthralled. George caught his eye, and Shadow raised his hand in silent greeting. As Shadow continued, he passed a lady with long grey hair selling sourdough bread that smelt tantalizingly good. Martin Plunkett, a local solicitor, was wearing a fake beard and seemed to be having a disagreement with the tall Viking warrior who was manning the beer tent. Shadow shook his head. It was clear the whole city had gone totally Viking mad. He took a few more steps before he felt a tap on his shoulder and heard a cheerful voice in his ear. "I didn't think this was your sort of thing, Chief." Shadow turned and scowled at the grinning face of Sergeant Jimmy Chang, his deputy. "Where have you been all day?" he asked impatiently. "I've been really busy investigating the protection racket, Chief." Recently, there had been a spate of smashed shop windows, and Jimmy was convinced there was more to it than mere coincidence. Shadow groaned loudly. "I've told you before. This is North Yorkshire, not Naples. We don't have protection rackets." "But, Chief," protested Jimmy, 10 businesses with broken windows in less than a month. There's something dodgy going on." "There will be a simple explanation. It'll be down to drunk students out of control after a night in the pub, or an attempted burglary by an inept thief." "There's never any witnesses or video surveillance footage. Nothing is ever stolen, and it's small, independent businesses, like kebab shops or off-licenses, that are always targeted." Jimmy was determined not to be put off, but Shadow shook his head, not convinced. "Exactly. Just the sort of places where a few young lads might end up after a heavy night drinking." "Well, the one last night was different. It was a toy shop on Lord Mayor's Walk, and this time something was taken." "Really? What?" Shadow asked in surprise. Jimmy looked down and shuffled his feet before he reluctantly replied, "It was a blue fluffy rabbit." Shadow barked out a laugh. "Oh, well, that's it then," he scoffed. "The Mafia have definitely infiltrated York. It may be over 25 years since I worked for the Met and had to deal with organised crime, but I distinctly remember the sole motivation of hardened gangsters was the acquisition of soft toys." Before they could argue any further, the detectives were interrupted by 2 drinking horns being thrust between them. The bearer was Sophie Newton, one of the pathologists they worked with. "Evening, gentlemen. Here, have this. I thought it might cheer you both up. Neither of you look like you're exactly channeling the spirit of the Vikings." Sophie, on the other hand, had clearly fully embraced the festivities. She was wearing her hair in long blonde plaits beneath what seemed to be the obligatory horned helmets. Both policemen thanked her, and Shadow took a large, grateful swig, but instead of the hoped-for drink of refreshing beer, his mouth was filled with an unfamiliar, sweet, spicy liquid. He grimaced as he swallowed it down. "Crikey, Sophie! What is it?" he asked, trying hard not to cough. "Mead," explained Sophie. "Fermented honey with cinnamon. It's what the Vikings used to drink, and is made to a traditional recipe, apparently. They call it the drink of the gods, and it's meant to turn anyone who partook into a poet or a scholar. Don't you like it, Chief?" "It must be an acquired taste." Shadow frowned as he sniffed the drink suspiciously. "Or maybe that's why the Vikings invaded England in the first place. They were simply looking for a decent drink." Then, realizing he sounded ungrateful, "Sorry, Sophie. It was a nice thought." "No problem," Sophie shrugged. She didn't look offended. He reasoned she was probably used to his occasional tendency to sound grumpy by now. "I think it's all right," said Jimmy as he took another swig. "Cheers, Sophie. The plats suit you, by the way." "Thanks, Jimmy," she beamed. "But you do know the real Vikings didn't actually have horns on their helmets," added Shadow. Sophie rolled her eyes at Jimmy before turning back to Shadow. "Don't you start, Chief. Mr. Bennington has already given me a 10-minute lecture on the subject. He's quite the expert. Anyway, shouldn't she be at Catania's or Little Sicily or somewhere?" Shadow's routine of eating at various Italian restaurants on different nights of the week was also well known to those he worked with. "Yes, I should," he complained indignantly. "I was planning on going to Francesco's place, but all the streets have been blocked off to create this chaos." The three of them continued slowly around the Viking village, passing tents selling leather belts and carved wooden trinkets. They came to a halt in front of a tent where a pretty blonde young woman in a rather low-cut tunic was offering to tell your fortune using ancient Viking rune stones. "All right, sweetheart. Do you want to cast the runes and see what the gods have in store for you, darling?" she asked, leaning forward and giving Jimmy a flirtatious smile. Her strong Cockney accent among all the northern voices made her stand out even more than her revealing dress. With his usual good-natured grin, Jimmy agreed and handed over his money. He shook the small leather pouch she handed him, and then emptied the smooth, square stones with their carved symbols out onto the table. The young woman made a big show of waving her hands around and studying the runes. Shadow suspected that, like all fortune-tellers, she was better at reading people than the runes. "The stones say you are ambitious, and you have a bright future," she announced. "There has been both happiness and sadness in your past. I see a mysterious blonde woman in the stones, and conflict with a dark-haired man. Beware of the letter E. Oh, and you'll have very good luck in love. I'm not surprised, a handsome lad like you," she finished with a wink. Jimmy blushed slightly as he thanked her. "Who knew lipstick was so readily available back then?" murmured Sophie quietly into her horn of mead, only loud enough for Shadow to hear. "What about you, sweetheart? Do you want to know what the gods have in store for you?" The fortune-teller had now turned her attention to Shadow. "Thank you, but no," he smiled politely. He had no interest in what the future might hold, unless it was to show him a quick route through this crowd. Suddenly, the mass of Vikings began to cheer loudly. Everyone turned to look as a large man of about 50 years old, with long dark hair streaked with grey, strode onto the platform. He placed his hands on his hips, and the breeze caught his red velvet cloak, so it flowed out behind him. It was an impressive sight. The rune girl gave an excited squeal and blew him a kiss. Shadow thought he looked vaguely familiar. In a deep, booming voice, the man on the platform addressed the gathered army. "I, King Ragnar, welcome you all to our great city of Jorvik." He paused while the cheers died down. "My Viking friends, together we shall celebrate our noble heritage, honor our mighty ancestors, and feast like gods. I therefore declare this year's Festival of the Vikings officially open." He dramatically drew his gleaming sword and jumped down from the platform. The great heathen army gave another deafening roar and banged their swords against their shields as they started to march after their leader. Shadow watched as King Ragnar exchanged a passionate kiss with the rune girl and pressed a small parcel into her hand before leading his troops on. "Where are they all off to now?" he asked, hoping it was away from Petergate, so he might finally be able to make it to his table at Francesco's. "King Ragnar's leading his troops back to the Viking encampment," explained Sophie. "Which is where?" "St. George's Field car park." "Well, they're lucky we've had such a dry start to September. Otherwise it would be flooded. It often is this time of year. It doesn't seem like the most sensible location to choose." "I suppose they needed to be close to the river for the longboat race. It's been advertised as one of the highlights of the festival. 12 traditional Viking longboats to race by torchlight from Skeldergate Bridge to Millennium Bridge and back." "For crying out loud!" Shadow exclaimed. He pressed his horn of mead back into Sophie's hand and hurriedly began to push his way through the crowd. "Was it something I said?" Sophie called out after him. Shadow didn't bother to reply, but he could hear Jimmy simply say, "Florence." Florence was the name of the narrowboat where Shadow lived. She was moored on the River Ouse, a little way down from Skeldergate Bridge. The thought of a dozen boats crewed by amateurs carrying naked flames heading towards her at speed filled him with horror. Hoping to outmaneuver the Vikings, who were marching towards Coppergate, he turned onto Market Street, then hurried on along Spurriergate and Tower Street. He reached Skeldergate Bridge just in time. Crowds of onlookers were beginning to gather, and in the distance he could hear the roar of the approaching army. Down on the bank of the river, the 12 longboats were moored, the shields lining their sides decorated with brightly coloured geometric designs or images of dragons and eagles. On the other side of the river, he could almost make out the shape of Florence. Her red roof and red and black sides were darkly silhouetted against the sky, but her name painted in gold and the flowers surrounding it glinted in the moonlight. Shadow crossed the bridge and dashed down the towpath, startling the geese, who honked loudly at him. He reached Florence as the Vikings arrived at the bridge. Swiftly he untied the mooring ropes, jumped aboard, pushed off from the bank with his foot, and started the engine. A few moments later, he was travelling downriver towards Fulford. As Florence chugged quietly along, the shouting and cheering from the longboat crews grew fainter. When she slipped beneath Millennium Bridge, the halfway point of the race, Shadow looked over his shoulder. He could see the glow from the torches. They were obviously on the river now and heading his way. To be safe, he steered Florence on for another 1/4 of a mile and moored her next to Fulford Ings. He was confident the longboats would not come as far as the nature reserve, although he was amazed the city council had given permission for the event to go ahead at all. In his experience, they were usually obsessed by health and safety. Any dead tree in the public parks was promptly chopped down before it could fall on a passerby, and they had even been known to tarmac over cobbled streets for fear someone may trip and hurt themselves. Yet they had allowed hordes of people holding burning torches and assorted weaponry to congregate by the river in the darkness. It was strange, to say the least. When Florence was safely secured to the large iron mooring ring on the riverbank, Shadow could finally step inside the boat and relax. He went straight through to the bedroom and took off his jacket and tie, glancing over at the photo of Louisa as he did so. He wondered what she would have made of the Viking Festival. No doubt she would have thrown herself into enjoying it. She was from southern Italy and far more sociable than him. Not that that was difficult. He remembered how she had once cajoled him into going to the Notting Hill Carnival when they lived in London. Louisa had loved the Caribbean music and brightly coloured costumes. He could picture her now, tossing her long dark hair as she joined in the samba dancing, while he self-consciously shuffled along next to her. With a sad shake of his head, Shadow closed the bedroom door behind him. It was over 25 years since he'd lost her in a car accident. But he still missed her like it was yesterday. As well as the bedroom and bathroom, Florence had a compact galley and comfortable living area. Shadow lit the small wood burner opposite the large, squashy sofa, then went in search of something to eat. The contents of his fridge could, at best, be described as sparse. There was, however, some leftover Sorrento ham and a loaf in the bread bin that was just on the right side of stale. He sighed. It wasn't the pollo facito he'd been hoping for, but it would have to do. His thoughts drifted back to Louisa. She had been an amazing cook. She could open a cupboard or fridge, and no matter what she found there, would create the most amazing dishes. He'd watch her simply throw ingredients into a pan, then ask her how she knew what she was doing without a recipe. She laughed at him, as she often did, and said simply, "Instinct." It didn't matter how many Italian restaurants he visited. Nobody cooked like Louisa. Shadow poured himself a large glass of Chianti, put on his favourite Frank Sinatra CD, and settled down onto the sofa. With his sandwich on one side and his unfinished Yorkshire Post crossword on the other, he could finally begin to unwind. He took a sip of wine and swilled it around his mouth, then swallowed it with a satisfied sigh. Finally, the lingering, sickly sweet taste of the mead was banished. He decided to relax and leave it a couple of hours before heading back. By then, the madness should have died down. A little while later, the crossword was complete. Frank had finished singing "How About You" for the second time, and the fire had died away to a few glowing embers. Shadow pulled his old, battered wax jacket back on and ventured outside to the deck. He strained his ears and eyes, but all seemed quiet. He cast off from the riverbank, turned Florence around, and headed back to the city. The moon was shining brightly in the clear sky, and his breath formed clouds in the cool night air as Florence quietly glided back under Millennium Bridge. Shadow tutted to himself as he spotted floating debris from the race. An extinguished torch, abandoned shield, even a false beard floated by. He approached Skeldergate Bridge with some trepidation. Although the boat race might be over, he was sure the Viking festivities would continue long into the night. However, as the bridge came into view, it wasn't the warm glow of burning torches that greeted him, but bright blue flashing lights. A tall, thin figure in a black leather jacket was jogging down the towpath in his direction. Shadow steered towards the bank and threw him the mooring rope. "I take it there's a problem, Sergeant." "We've got a body, Chief," replied Jimmy as he tied a knot in the rope, tightly securing Florence's position. Shadow ducked inside to put his jacket and tie back on. He couldn't say he felt especially surprised at Jimmy's news. The more he'd thought about it, the more the whole staging of tonight's event seemed to him utter folly. "Drowned or burnt?" he inquired as he stepped off the boat and onto the towpath. "Neither, Chief. A stabbing. Someone has stuck a 30-inch sword right through King Ragnar." Chapter 2. Down 6. 5 letters. Ulfbert's sharp words are etched here. King Ragnar was, in reality, Alfred Campbell. He was one of York's wealthiest and most well-known businessmen. His photograph was often featured in the local press, which was why he had seemed so familiar to Shadow. About 25 years ago, he had discovered a hoard of Viking treasure on farmland he owned on the outskirts of Fulford. His share was worth millions, and he became rich overnight, selling most of the treasure to museums and collectors. He had, however, kept a few choice pieces, and using his new fortune set up various Viking-themed ventures in the city. Along with the annual festival, there was the Daneholm Museum, with a shop that catered to tourists and school parties. He had also opened Asgard's Bar, and even a nightclub called Valhalla, both named after the Viking idea of heaven. As the two policemen made their way back over the bridge, Jimmy filled Shadow in on what had happened. After the longboat race had finished, King Ragnar, or Alfred, was due to present the victorious crew with a trophy, but he was nowhere to be seen. Edward Bennington, the secretary of the festival, had gone in search of him and discovered his body in King Ragnar's palace, and called the emergency services immediately. "Is Sophie with the body?" asked Shadow. Jimmy shook his head. "No, she's not on duty tonight. We just left at the end of the race when I got the call and came straight back." "I see," Shadow nodded, quietly noting the way Jimmy had said we'd just left, but more concerned that this meant he would have to deal with Donaldson, the other, far less amenable pathologist. Despite the late hour, there was still a large crowd of Vikings and tourists gathered outside the encampment, trying to see what was going on. Shadow stepped across the cordon. He nodded his thanks to the uniformed officers, who were doing their best to keep control, helped by a few burly security guards in fluorescent jackets. The encampment in St. George's Field car park was more elaborate than the one in St. Sampson's Square. Instead of tents, several low wooden structures with roofs almost sloping to the ground had been erected. The largest of these was decorated with animal skulls and had the words King Ragnar's Palace painted above the door in Nordic-style letters. A young constable held the door open for Shadow and Jimmy as they approached. "Thank you, Constable. Don't let anyone through without my say-so," ordered Shadow. "Certainly not, sir. It's Tom, by the way, sir," replied the young man eagerly. "Thank you, Tom," said Shadow as he stepped across the threshold. Inside the palace, painted shields and more animal skulls and horns covered the walls. Long wooden tables with benches ran along each side, and there was a smouldering fire in the center of the room, with the smoke drifting up to a hole in the roof. At the far end were two carved wooden throne-style chairs, with a heavy black curtain hanging behind. "The body's through here, Chief," said Jimmy, as he pushed aside the curtain. Shadow stepped through into a smaller anteroom. Another fire surrounded by stones was burning on the floor of the room. There was a wooden bed covered in fur throws pushed against the wall. There was also a fur rug on the floor beneath the body. In the center of the room were two wooden chairs and a table. Jimmy began busily using his phone to take photos from various angles. Shadow took in the details of the scene while trying very hard not to look directly at the wound and the copious amount of blood on the floor. Despite a career in the police that spanned over 30 years, Shadow was still incredibly squeamish. The dead man's hands were resting on the hilt of the sword. There was a length of black, silky material covering his eyes and tied around the back of his head. On the table was an open bottle of expensive French red wine and two full glasses. "No mead in a horn for King Ragnar," thought Shadow. By the way he'd fallen, it looked like Alfred was sitting on the chair with his back to the curtain before the sword had struck him, and he'd slumped down onto the floor. "What are you thinking, Chief?" asked Jimmy, switching on his electronic notebook, ready to begin taking notes. "I'm thinking that for such a brutal death, it's a remarkably peaceful crime scene. No signs of a struggle. The glasses haven't been knocked over. There's not even a single drop of wine spilt. Wow, you're right.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?